we're talking about such a hot topic like it is 5G. There is a conventional message flying around that countries must accelerate 5G deployments, especially Latin America must accelerate 5G deployments in order to compete with most advanced countries. That message about the urgency of 5G has been widely spread by vendor companies that provide network equipment, and has been also adopted by some of the governments. And of course, the world is going fast, and most advanced countries are already involved in 5G rollouts or are planning to do so immediately. Between this year and next year, we will see 5G commercial offers in Korea, Australia, United States, Canada, UK, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and I can continue with the list. So, of course, Latin America cannot afford to be left behind again in this race. We are clear about that, because 5G, as it has already been said here, is a revolutionary technology that is a big opportunity for digitalization, for IoT, for the Industry 4.0. And Latin America has a historical productivity problem. If you analyze the history of Latin America, you will see that productivity levels are almost flat. GDP has grown. In particular, since year 2000, the GDP has grown a lot, but productivity is almost flat. Why? Because GDP has grown mainly because of natural resources, commodity prices, soya, meat, whatever. Latin America production structure is most dependent, or is a lot dependent, on natural resources and with low value added, and as a result, productivity is a structural problem in the region, and digitalization is an opportunity to overcome that productivity problems, or to produce a jump in productivity levels that the region is needing. There is a recent report by McKinsey that analyzed the recent economic growth of Latin America and also provides some forecasts for the next years in Latin America. And they conclude that if Latin America is not able to introduce substantial productivity gains in the next few years, the economic growth, the GDP growth of the next 15 years will be the half than that of the previous 15 years. So that is an important slowdown. And digitalization is clearly the key, especially 5G, that provides so much opportunities for productivity gains, for the manufacturing industry, for any kind of service or productive situation that has strict requirements of speed, of latency, and so on. So we're clear about that. However, in Latin America, there are also some key economic issues that must be taken into account before or when analyzing in detail 5G deployments. In the first place, we will have to know which is the investment required in order to launch and to massify the latest technologies such as 5G. We will have to find out which is the impact in the CAPEX and in the OPEX, in investment and in operation expenditures of telecom operators that have not yet turned down 2G networks, that are still available in some places in Latin America. And those telecom operators have not yet finished the deployments of 4G It is still early days for 4G. Not only to massify 4G, but also for those who made the investments to get the profit back from the return from those investments. Also, it is not clear which will be the cost of spectrum required for 5G, such as the millimetrical waves. It is not clear which is the expected return of those investments, in the case for the telecom operators, and so on. So, which is the current context for 5G in Latin America? Is it suitable, or do we need important reforms in order to make this equation, this economic equation, to make sense? To have a business case that promotes this kind of investments. Well, Latin America, I don't know if everybody here knows, but Latin America has the revenues from users among the lowest of the world in the telecom sector. The ARPU, average revenue per user, in Latin America is much less than $10 every month. I don't know if it is 9 or 8, but it has already went down from that threshold. In the US, it is over 40, the revenue per user. In Europe, I don't have the exact figure, but it's over 30, 35 perhaps. So, and also, it is presenting a negative trend. It is going down. So that is important to take into account in this equation. You can also find these negative trends in the sectorial income, in the EBITDA margins, in the cash flows, as a result of the intense competition within the digital ecosystem, the competition from traditional providers with internet services, and so on. Also, you have in most Latin America countries outdated regulations. Regulations that were launched when the telecommunications was in the times of privatization, before the massive deployments of mobile, and much before the convergence era. So most legal frameworks in Latin America are from a time when each service has a specific infrastructure. That is not the case today. Now we are in the convergence era, where multiple services can be provided by multiple platforms. That needs an adjustment. Also, you have restrictions for network deployments in a lot of countries. Barriers, for instance, municipal barriers to install cells, to deploy networks, to bureaucracy, permits, and so on. There is a lot of work to do there. High spectrum prices, sometimes spectrum awards are seen by governments as an opportunity to collect money to cover deficit or for general expenditure of the government. Also, we have high taxation levels. We produced a study some years ago with Professor Raúl Katz from Columbia University. He compared the taxation applicable to telecom sector in Latin America with the taxation applicable to the other sectors of the economy, especially those sectors that are similar in terms of public services, utilities, or so on. And he found out that the telecom sector in Latin America was taxed at 51% over the average of all the other industries. So we have a problem there. On the one hand, we are talking about a service that we want to massify for everybody, and on the other hand, it is taxed over the other sectors. There is a contradiction there. And current CAPEX intensity in Latin America is high. The ratio between CAPEX and revenue is in rounding 20% in Latin America, that it's already high in international terms. So Despite some interesting initiatives that we are seeing about introducing the laser technologies, Latin America is in the middle of a complex scenario. And in some terms, it is still lagging. For instance, operators are still investing in 4G and still need to make profitable the investments in 4G first. There is also a lot of expectancy on the development and deployments in leader countries, and regulators still have yet to design strategies or plans to allocate spectrum for 5G. The investments that will have to be carried out in order to launch 5G in Latin America will depend mostly on, in the first place, spectrum, and in the second place, to continue current deployments of 4G, to massify cells, and also of fiber optic because of the fixed components of 5G networks. Fiber optic is key for the backhaul. Well, in terms of spectrum acquisition, Latin America is a way down the levels of spectrum recommended by the ITU. It depends on the country, but so 30% perhaps of that levels. In terms of 4G, Belén said before, 35% of mobile connections are 4G right now, so there is still a way to go there. And in terms of fiber, only 6% of fixed broadband access is in fiber in Latin America, while in OECD it is 17%, that figure. So there is still some way to go, and we must take that into account in our economic equation. For instance, in Korea, nowadays, it is much cheaper to deploy 5G than in Latin America, because they already have covered the country with fiber and with 4G, for instance. So we need to have those questions answered, and in order to have a clear picture about this being a business case to promote those investments. We need a clear study of what is going on in Latin America, what are the costs involved, which is the economic value of IoT and Industry 4.0 in Latin America, and which is the role of public policies. In that respect, I want to make some considerations of public policies. One of the things you were talking, Scott, was about the difference of internet in Sao Paulo and in Amazonas, for instance. Well, in Latin America, there are a lot of isolated areas that need to be connected. In Latin America, we have a complex geography. We have mountains, we have forests, we have rivers, and we have a digital divide to close. We have a lot of people that is still not connected. In that respect, closing the digital divide is one of the urgent things that has Latin America. And an example on that is a recent initiative, Internet para Todos, IPT, that it has been deployed in Peru with the objective of providing connectivity to those that do not have it today. This is an interesting project because it has involved companies from different origins. From the telecommunications sector, it is Telefónica involved. From the OTT world, or the internet world, it is Facebook. Also, the development banks like CAF or IDB, all together in this project. I wanted to put that into value in order to provide connectivity to isolated areas. We also need to have openness for the technological mix. We're in the era of convergence. The satellite has a lot to do in the 5G ecosystem, and not only for the remote regions, also for backhaul. That is an important issue. We need new regulatory frameworks that are suitable for convergence. That that consists of applying the principle of technological neutrality to regulations. That is much more suitable to what is happening nowadays than outdated regulations. Why take whatever thing, privacy or data protection? Why some companies must have a specific treatment of those data and others not? That does not have any sense in this convergence era. We also must facilitate network deployments. I talked before about bureaucracy, permits. 5G needs a lot of fiber and 4G deployments, small cell deployments. There is a lot to do in that areas at a municipal level, at a country level, in coordination terms. Sometimes there is overlapping regulations or regulations that contradict each other depending on the national or subnational level. That is a problem that we have, those are barriers that we have in Latin America. Spectrum. More spectrum is needed, that is very clear. Latin America is still far away from ITU recommendations, but it is needed in reasonable conditions. Okay? It is needed in the framework of licenses that need to have some temporal length in order to make those investments profitable. We still have countries in Latin America, such as Paraguay, that offers 5-year license of spectrum. Colombia has recently changed the law, but till last month it was 10 years. That is a too short period of time in order to make profitable these investments. I believe that 20 years or more is what we are needing. Secondary market for spectrum. The more flexibility you can achieve in the market, the best outcome in terms of efficiency for the market. And very important, spectrum policy should not be part of the fiscal policy. A spectrum award should have as the main objective to massify deployments of networks, not to collect a large amount of money for the government. I wanted also to talk about taxation, very related to this. I recently talked about that 51% of more tax pressure than other industries. There is a current approach or a conventional wisdom in Latin America that has been installed that stipulates that in order to balance fiscal budgets, governments can increase the tax burden on telecommunication industry without suffering any setback. And we have examples on that. Yeah. And we have examples on that. For instance, in Ecuador, it has been introduced a royalty system by which any telecom operator that has over 30% of the market share should pay a royalty, for instance. And in other countries, we have examples of taxation levels for reasons that have nothing to do with telecommunications. For instance, in El Salvador, a country that has security problems with robberies and theft and so on, it has been introduced a special contribution for security applied to the telecommunications sector. So for some topics that are social demands, where do we collect money for there? The telecommunications sector. In Colombia, there were also stipulated fiscal revenues to finance the post-conflict strategy in that country, and also applied to the telecommunication sector. So we need to make a rethink in this taxation approach if we want to massify investments and also to get the users to acquire and to make affordable these services. We need a fiscal policy to maximize the potential of the digital economy in our region, a fiscal policy that should be neutral in its approach. Every firm should pay taxes under the same rules in line with the sales of that firm or the profit that makes that firm. That is not the case in Latin America, especially in this convergence era and in this wider digital ecosystem that we have today, that it was not the digital ecosystem of the past. We should avoid any specific or special taxation that produces a damage to the sector. Taxation should be based on general taxes, and we have a problem that Europe also has it, of the income from taxes because of the base erosion and the profit shifting that should be tackled, of course, with initiatives such as the BEPS initiatives, but also the value-added taxes. In that sense, some companies within the digital ecosystem pay value-added taxes and some others not. However, some countries are starting to change that approach. One of them is my country, Uruguay, that, for instance, a user of Netflix has to pay value-added tax. That was not the case before. And just to end, spectrum policy, again, should not be part of fiscal policy. I can finish this intervention right now and later answer questions.
Good. No, I think that's a pretty good, a pretty comprehensive start. I think actually a lot of our comments are broadly in line across the panels here. I'll take the liberty of explaining a couple of terms here, since a lot of the people in the audience are not telecoms experts. So on the one hand, we keep using the word backhaul. For a mobile network, there are towers. That's really the thing that provides the signals that go to your mobile phone. They have to be connected somehow to what generally is a fixed network, and the backhaul is the physical fixed network connection by which data is transmitted from the rest of the world to those cell towers. We also talked about generally, yes, not satellites. Satellites a different world. I was talking about mobile terrestrial networks. I saw your hand.
I'm worried about the report of Brazil.
Okay, well, 5G also is satellites, so that's a fair point. Let's come back to you. I'll do some term definition. I saw you had your hand up. As far as spectrum auctions, if you simply read the newspapers, you would think that auctions exist to raise money for the government. That actually isn't the reason why they were put in place. The original basis comes from work done by Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase. It's done really for allocative efficiency. The idea is that an auction is the most efficient way to make sure that the resource goes to whoever values it most and therefore is likely to use it best. So that's why the auction exists. A concern that's exists in many places, including in Europe, is that frequently you've got the finance manager for the country setting the reserve price for the spectrum instead of it being done to ensure that the spectrum gets out where it's going. Often the price will be set at whatever the deficit for the country happened to be for that year. This shouldn't happen, but it does happen. Secondary markets was mentioned. The idea is that the price of spectrum can be reflected not only at the time when it's initially auctioned, but if it's possible to lease or sell it later, then errors in the auction can be corrected, and it also means that the people who hold the spectrum are confronted with the opportunity cost, and therefore, again, hopefully will be under some pressure to ensure that the spectrum is used efficiently. And this actually has also been a consideration for the military and for public users as well. Okay, well, I guess that's enough on definitions, which I thought would be useful. Actually, one other reflection I'll make before I hand over to Elena. You were talking before about the value of Latin American innovations. On the regulatory policy side, as we've heard, not everything in Latin America are things that Europe could learn from, but some things are. Actually, one particular innovation that I'll flag, following up on a point that Juan made, is that the whole notion of reverse auctions in order to achieve coverage, that was pioneered by World Bank initiatives under Bjorn Wallenius years ago. The idea of essentially having parties bid to cover the national territory at lowest cost. It was pioneered in places like Chile and Peru, and has been
Beauty contest.
Getting away from beauty contest and having more of a competition to see who could cover the country at lowest cost. Yes, I think that's your point. So again, these are things that have become part of global best practice. They're reflected in European state aid rules. They were done first in Latin America. So we can learn things from everywhere. Okay, now with that, over to Elena, who has been patiently waiting for me. Off you go.
No, I'm not going to talk as an expert. I'm more than 7 years working as a player of telecoms, especially in America. But I think that the point is that why 5G? I think Belen wants to raise this argument in order to say now everybody has to have 5G. But I think we have to be in the previous stage to understand why 5G. And 5G is not just a new generation of the cellular or mobile telecommunications, but a new network in which we have different technologies, including satellite. Without satellite, there is no 5G at all, because I think what it changed is the concept of network. So you have everything connected, not only people, but things, of course. And but I think it's more important to understand how the economy